Welcome, friend. Tonight we step back in time into the vast wilderness of Thefrontier, a world where survival was not a choice but a daily challenge. As you set it into rest, let your mind wander through forests, cabins, and quiet plains, as we uncover what frontier survival was really like. Imagine for a moment that the year is somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. The modern world, has not yet spread its arms across the continent. There are no highways cutting through the land, no electric lights glowing in the night, no constant hum of engines or chatter off radio. Instead, you stand before an open horizon that seems to stretch forever. To one side, forests rise, thick and shadowed, filled with the whisper-soft wind moving through countless trees. To the other, grasslands roll endlessly, tall blades bending under the sweep of the breeze. Beyond, rivers carve their way through stone, and mountains loom in the distance like guardians of an unbroken wilderness. This was Thefrontier, a place untamed, vast, and filled with both promise and peril. Those who stepped into this world were not stepping into comfort. They were not moving toward a life of easy convenience. They were leaving behind towns and settlements, where a blacksmith might repair tools, a market might sell bread, or a doctor might offer medicine. Once they crossed into the frontier, those things were left behind. The reality of the frontier was simple and harsh. Whatever you needed, you would have to create with your own two hands. The land could give, but it could also take away, and every day was a quiet test of endurance. Consider the journey itself. Many families traveled westward in wagons, pulled by oxen or horses, carrying only the essentials. Furniture, delicate keepsakes, and luxuries had Tobe left behind. Instead, wagons held tools, sacks of grain, iron pots, spare cloths, and little else. Every pound mattered. Every object had to serve a purpose. On the trail, there were no smooth roads. The wheels cut through mud after heavy rains, cracked over stones, and creaked along uneven paths. The further you went, the more the familiar fell away, until at last you were surrounded only by the raw, wild land. The wilderness was not empty. It had been home for centuries to native peoples who knew its secrets, its cycles, and its dangers. For settlers, though, it was a place of uncertainty. Forests seemed endless, and pre-rescald feel overwhelming in their vast silence. The nights were darker than anything most people had ever known, with no lamps but the fire you carried. The stars stretched above in unimaginable numbers. Coyotes howled in the distance. Owls called out from the trees, and beneath that sky, each family huddled together, knowing they were far from the safety of civilization. To serve here meant learning to read the land. Streams could provide fresh water, but they could also flood suddenly, sweeping away wagons or drowning livestock. Forests could supply wood for fires and cabins, but they also hid predators, wolves, bears, and mountain lions, each a threat to both animals and humans. Grasslands offered rich soil for planting, but without trees for shelter. The winds blew strong and merciless, sometimes carrying storms that tore through crops in a single night. There was no store to walk into when food supplies ran low. Families planted seeds, but the crops took months to grow, and the earth did not always yield generously. Hunters might track deer or rabbits, but the hunt could last days, and success was never guaranteed. Sometimes hunger pressed close, and every bite of dried meat or handful of cornmeal became precious. Winters made things harder still. Snow blocked paths, froze rivers, and buried cabins. Firewood had to be gathered, because without it, nights could be unbearable. And yet, for all hardships, the frontier offered something that drew people into it. Land, opportunity, the promise of a new life. For many, the crowded towns back east had grown too restrictive. Land, ways, expensive, jobs were scarce, and poverty was common. The frontier, though dangerous, promised space. Here, if you could endure the hardship, you might claim acres of soil to farm, forests to harvest, and a chance to build a life shaped by your own hands. That promise pulled thousands forward, each of them willing to face isolation and uncertainty for the hope of freedom. Imagine yourself waking on a frontier morning. The sun rises slowly, lighting tops of the trees and spilling across the plains. The air is sharp and cool, carrying scents of pine or grass. Your shelter is simple, perhaps just a canvas tent at first. Later, a cabin built from logs you cut yourself. The ground beneath you is uneven, but you've grown used to it. You step outside, hearing the cry of birds and the distant movement of animals in the undergrowth. There is no traffic, no chatter off neighbors, only silence, deep and endless, broken by the natural sounds o' far living world. Tasks begin early. Water must be fetched from a stream, carried a mile or more. Fires must be rekindled for cooking. Tools need sharpening, animals need feeding, and fields need tending. There is no one else to do it for you. Each task is necessary, and if it is neglected, the consequences are immediate. Without water, thirst sets in. Without fire, warmth vanishes. Without planting, the future holds hunger. The frontier taught people discipline not through rules or schedules, but through necessity. Life depended on constant labor. It is easy from a modern perspective to think off the frontier in romantic terms, the beauty of wide open spaces, the inability of independence, the charm of rustic living. But the truth was more. Reservoir, illness, even a small one, could turn deadly without doctors nearby. Acute from an axe could become infected. Fevers might sweep through children, and childbirth was among the most dangerous moments a woman could face. A broken leg meant weeks of immobility, and without help, survival was uncertain. Every family knew these risks, and still they pressed onward. Nights were perhaps the most humbling. When the last fire died down, the darkness pressed close, heavy and absolute. Families sat together by the glow of embers, telling stories, singing soft songs, or simply resting in silence. The howl of wolves reminded them they were not alone. Some autumn storms rolled in, thunder shaking the cabin walls, lightning splitting desky, rain drummed endlessly on the roof. In those moments, the strength of their shelter was tested, and prayers were whispered for safety. Yet, in the quiet of clear nights, there was also wonder. With no lanterns to block the view, festers shone brighter than anyone in towns could ever imagine. The milky waste stretched like a river of light across the sky. Shooting stars crossed overhead. Families gazed upward, perhaps feeling small, but also connected to something vast and eternal. In those moments, the hardships faded slightly, replaced by awe. The land itself became both teacher and adversary. People learned to read signs of weather in the shape of clouds and the behavior of animals. They learned which plants could heal and which could harm. They discovered how to track game, how to build traps, and how to preserve food by smoking or salting it. They found ways to use every resource: bones for tools, hides for clothing, ash for soap. Waste, a luxury they could not afford. Every part of life was shaped by themes of survival, and over time, those who endured grew strong, both in body and in spirit. But the frontier was not only about physical endurance, it also tested the heart and the mind. Loneliness weighed heavily. Neighbors might live miles away, and months could pass without seeing another soul beyond your family. Letters, when they came, traveled slowly, sometimes taking weeks or months to reach you. The sense of distance was immense, as though the rest of the world had fallen away. In isolation, people leaned deeply on one another. Families grew close, bound by necessity, by love, and by shared struggle. Every sunrise felt like an accomplishment. To wake, to step into the cold morning, to see the land still standing before you. This was survival. Every harvest, no matter how small, was a victory. Every safe return from a hunt was a relief. Even the smallest comforts, a loaf of bread baked from your own flour, a blanket stitched by hand, a moment of laughter by the fire, carried a weight that modern comforts often lack. On the frontier, nothing was taken for granted. Everything was earned. So when we speak of the frontier setting, we speak not only of the physical place, the forests, plains, rivers, and mountains, but also of the condition of life itself, a condition defined by hardship, yes, but also by resilience, defined by danger, but also by possibility. The frontier was not kind, but it was honest. It gave nothing freely. And yet, for those who could endure, it offered a chance at something rarer: life, built directly from theoth, shaped entirely by one's own determination. And in that way, the frontier setting was more than a backdrop. It was a force that shaped character, molded families, and forged a spirit of endurance that still echoes through history. Imagine yourself standing in a clearing at the edge of a dense forest. The trees rise tall and straight, their trunks marked with the work of an axe. The ground under your feet is uneven, soft, with pine needle sand, scattered leaves. The air smells of fresh wood, sharp and clean, carrying with it the faint smoke of a fire that burns nearby. Before you stands a log cabin, small, simple, but strong, built from the very trees that surround it. This cabin is not grand, not polished, not like the houses of towns back east. It is rough and imperfect, yet it is the very heart of survival. On the frontier, to build a cabin was often the first task of a family arriving on the land. Wagons could serve as temporary shelter. Demands of survival. And over time, those who endured grew strong, both in body and in spirit. But the frontier was not only about physical endurance. It also tested the heart and the mind. Loneliness weighed heavily. Neighbors might live miles away, and months could pass without seeing another soul beyond your family. Letters, when they came, traveled slowly, sometimes taking weeks or months to reach you. The sense of distance was immense, as though the rest of the world had fallen away. In isolation, people leaned deeply on one another. Families grew close, bound by necessity, by love, and by shared struggle. Every sunrise felt like an accomplishment. To wake, to step into the cold morning, to see the land still standing before you. This was survival. Every harvest, no matter how small, was a victory. Every safe return from a hunt was a relief. Even the smallest comforts, a loaf of bread baked from your own flour, a blanket stitched by hand, a moment of laughter by the fire, carried a weight that modern comforts often lack. On the frontier, nothing was taken for granted. Everything was earned. So when we speak of the frontier setting, we speak not only of the physical place, forests, plains, rivers, and mountains, but also of the condition of life itself, a condition defined by hardship, yes, but also by resilience, defined by danger, but also by possibility. The frontier was not kind, but it was honest. It gave nothing freely. And yet, for those who couldn't, it offered a chance at something rarer, life, built directly from theoth, shaped entirely by one's own determination. And in that way, the frontier setting was more than a backdrop. It was a force that shaped character, molded families, and forged a spirit of endurance that still echoes through history. Imagine yourself standing in a clearing at the edge of a dense forest. The trees rise tall and straight, their trunks marked with the work of an axe. The ground under your feet is uneven, soft with pine needle sand, scattered leaves. The air smells of fresh wood, sharp and clean, carrying with it the faint smoke of a fire that burns nearby. Before you stands a log cabin, small, simple, but strong, built from the very trees that surround it. This cabin is not grand, not polished, not like the houses of towns back east. It is rough and imperfect, yet it is the very heart of survival. On the frontier, to build a cabin was often the first task of a family arriving on the land. Wagons could serve as temporary shelter. Tents could hold out the weather for a time, but winter would come, and only strong walls could keep out the biting cold. Families arrived with axes, saws, and little more, and with those simple tools they set to work. Trees were felled one by one, their trunks cut to manageable lengths, stripped of bark, and dragged to the site chosen for the cabin. The work was exhausting. Each swing of the axe demanded strength. Each log, carried by hand or animal, tested endurance. Yet with every log laid up another, a home slowly began to rise. The first cabins were not much larger than a single room, perhaps 15 feet by 20, with space for little more than a fireplace, a table, and a few rough beds. The roof might be covered in wooden shingles, split by hand, or, in some cases, thick pieces of sod laid carefully to keep out rain. Windows, if they existed at all, were small and covered with oiled paper or animal hide stretched thin, letting in only the faintest glow of daylight. Glass was a luxury, far too rare and expensive for most. The floor was often nothing more than packed earth, swept smooth each morning. Some families might, over time, lay planks of wood, but for many, the floor remained for years. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, wood, and earth. The fireplace, built of stones gathered nearby, was both the kitchen and the source of warmth. Its fire never truly went out, for to let it die meant the struggle of sparking new flames with flint in the cold. Pots hung from iron hooks, and bread baked in the coals. The smoke sometimes filled the room, curling up into the rafters, before finding its way out through gaps in the roof or a crude chimney. Clothes hung from pegs on the wall, tools rested in corners, and the few possessions a family carried from their old life were carefully arranged where they would not better. Imaged nights in the cabin were quiet, save for the crackle of the fire. Families often shared a single sleeping space. Straw mattresses stuffed in tissue, perhaps covered with blankets made from wool or animal skins, lay close together for warmth. Children might sleep lofted above near therifters where the rising heat gathered, while parents lay closer to the hearth. Privacy was non-existent, but safety and warmth mattered more. In winter, thick-cabin walls groaned against the cold, and snow piled high against the outside. Inside, the family huddled close, thankful for the fire that kept frost from their skin. Every detail of cabin life spoke of hard labor. Water had to be carried from a nearby stream, bucket by bucket, each drop hauled by hand. Cooking meant grinding grain with Asmal mill or pounding it with stones. Washing clothes required boiling water over the fire, scrubbing each piece by hand, and then hanging them on branches or lines stretched between walls. Light came only from the fire or from candles made of tallow, which smoked and sputtered, but gave enough glow to sew, mend, or read a Bible by in the evening. Cabins were not just shelter from the weather. They were fortresses against the unknown. The wilderness pressed close, and dangers were never far away. Wolves might circle at night, their ice glowing faintly in the dark. Bears could wander near, curious at the scent of food. Insects invaded during the warmer months, and mice scurried across floors, nibbling at stored grain. The thick log walls stood as a defense imperfect but vital. A strong latch on the door gave at least the comfort of security, even if only symbolic. Inside, the family could feel that they had carved out a small circle of safety in a vast, indifferent world. The cabin was also a place of constant noise, not from machines or streets, but from life itself. The fire popped and hissed, the wind whistled through cracks in the logs, and rain drummed on the roof with steady rhythm. In summer, the buzz often sex was relentless, and in winter the silence was broken only by the howl of wind. Children's voices echoed against the walls, laughter mixed with cries and the sounds of work. Wood being chopped, bread dough being kneaded, clothes being mended were part of every day. The cabin was alive with effort, never truly still except in the deep of night when all slept. Despoteth roughness, there was comfort, too. The walls, though uneven, held heat in winter. The roof, though sometimes leaky, offered shade from summer sun. Families decorated with what little they had, perhaps a rug woven by hand, a quilt of bright colors stitched carefully, or a shelf holding a treasured book. These small touches made a space feel like more than just survival. They made it a home. A visitor stepping inside would see not just a crude room of logs, but the effort of people shaping comfort out of hardship. Cabin life demanded cooperation. No one person could build and maintain it alone. Men, women, and children each had roles. Men cut and hauled logs, but women often helped fit them into place, sealed gaps with mud or clay, and kept fires burning to cook for those working. Children gathered stones for the hearth, carried water, or held tools. Later, when the cabin was standing, the entire family worked to keep it in order. Roofs needed patching after storms. Walls needed sealing each season, and furniture had to be made by hand. A table might be nothing more than a plank balanced on stumps, yet it was a table where meals were shared, stories told, and prayers spoken. The isolation of cabin life was intense. Families often went weeks without seeing another household. When neighbors did visit, it was an event to be remembered. Doors opened in welcome, and the cabin filled with warmth, laughter, and shared meals. Guests slept on the floor or wherever space could be found, because on the frontier, hospitality was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Everyone knew, though tone day, they too might be in need of shelter on a journey, and the cabins of others would be the only places to find it. Seasons brought change to cabin life. In spring, the cabins smelled of fresh earth and growing plants as gardens were tilled just outside the walls. The door often stood open to let in cool air, though mosquitoes and flies inevitably followed. Summer brothiote, and the cabin grew stifling in the afternoons. So many tasks moved outdoors. In autumn, the cabin filled with the scents of harvest apple, drying herbs hanging from rafters, jars of preserved food stored in corners. Winter brought stillness, and the cabin became the entire world. Outside, snow lay deep, but inside, the family gathered near the fire, telling stories and singing songs to pass the long, dark hours. Cabin life was not easy, but it forged strength. It taught patience, discipline, and resilience. Each log, each stone, each effort invested in the home was a reminder that survival was possible, that even in the harshest wilderness, people could carve out a space of warmth and safety. The cabin was not perfect, but it was a symbol of endurance. It stood as proof that human determination could turn raw wilderness into shelter, loneliness into family, and hardship into life. And so when you imagine the life of those on the frontier, picture the cabin, picture its rough logs, its smoking chimney, its earthen floor. Picture the firelight flickering on faces gathered close, the sound of wind outside while warmth glowed within. Picture the resilience it took to build, to maintain, and to live each day inside those walls. This Waskabin life on the frontier, not grand, not easy, but deeply human, filled with struggle and filled with mourning, with quiet anticipation. Sometimes the traps were empty. Sometimes they held food that meant the difference between hunger and survival. Women bore equal burdens, though often in different forms. Inside the cabin, there was no rest from labor. Bread had to be baked, vegetables prepared, herbs dried, and food preserved for the days when fresh supplies were scarce. Butter was churned by hand, milk poured back and forth until it thickened. Clothes had to be sewn, patched, and washed. Washing meant hauling water from a stream, boiling it over the fire, scrubbing each garment on rough boards, and wringing them dry with aching hands. Even children's clothing, weakly outgrown and worn thin, required hour-soft mending. Every scrap of cloth was precious, every stitch a necessity. Children, too, were drawn into these daily struggles. They gathered kindling from the forest, carried buckets of water, fed chickens or pigs, and helped tend the family's small plot of land. Schooling, if it happened at all, was often done at home in brief moments between chores. A mother might teach letters and numbers while bread baked, or a father might read aloud from a single treasured book by firelight at night. Play existed, but it was often simple and tied to work itself. A child might play at farming while helping in the field, or create games from stones and sticks while keeping watch over livestock. Livestock demanded constant attention. Cows, goats, pigs, and chickens provided milk, meat, and eggs, but they also required food, shelter, and care. Fences had to be built and repaired, barns patched, and animals guarded. A fox could decimate a flock of chickens in a single night, and wolves or bears posed constant threats to larger animals. Each morning, families checked on their animals with a mixture of hope and worry, praying they had survived another night. Illness added another layer to the daily struggles. With no doctors nearby, even a simple fever could spread fear. Herbs and home remedies were used, but their effectiveness was uncertain. Mothers often kept knowledge of plants and healing close at hand, passing it down from one generation to the next. Still, sickness lingered in the background of daily life. Reminder that survival depended not just on strength and effort, but also on fortune and resilience. Weather was perhaps the greatest adversary. In summer, the heat could wither crops and exhaust workers. In winter, snow and ice pressed in, making every task harder, every movement slower. Families prepared for these seasons with all the energy they had, storing food, cutting wood, and sealing cabins against the elements. But no amount of preparation could remove the uncertainty. A late frost could kill you plants. A storm could sweep away months of effort. Each day carried with it the burden of unpredictability, and each family learned to endure whatever the sky brought. Despite the constant hardship, there were moments of smell joy woven into these struggles. The first taste of fresh bread from Newfler, the sight of children chasing each other across a field, the warmth of fire on a cold night. These moments gave strength to continue. Neighbors, though often miles away, might gather for shared work, raising a barn or harvesting a field. Those times of community were treasured deeply. The laughter, the songs, the shared meals. These were reminders that life was not only toil, but also connection. The frontier demanded everything of those who lived on it. Each day was a balance of energy, resources, and determination. A single mistake, tool left to rust, a fence left unrepaired, a fire left untended, could bring consequences that echoed for weeks or months. Yet, through disciplined persistence, families managed. They found a rhythm in the struggle, a floto, the endless cycle of work, rest, and work again. Evenings brought a tempora pause. After the chores were finished, after the animals were secured and the fields quiet, families gathered inside the cabin once more. Supper was eaten slowly, often little more than stew or bread, but it was shared with gratitude. The fire burned low, casting soft light across weary faces. Stories were told, prayers were whispered, and songs might be sung in gentle voices. Children drifted to sleep first, curled together under blankets, while parents stayed awake a little longer, discussing tomorrow's work, or simply sitting in silence, listening to the night. Outside, the wilderness stretched listlessly. Coyotes yipped. In the distance, crickets sang, and the wind carried scents of pine and grass. Inside, the cabin walls held firm, and for a few hours the family rested. Tomorrow would bring the same endless tasks, the same struggles, the same demands of survival. Yet in those quiet hours there was peace. The daily struggles of frontier life were unending, but they forged people of remarkable endurance. Each sunrise was met with determination. each hardship faced with courage, and each small success cherished with deep gratitude. The frontier offered no ease, no comfort freely given, but it did offer strength to those who accepted its trials. And as each family lived out these days, flobber and struggle, they wrote a story of resilience that still echoes soft Lithro history. Imagine the sun setting beyond the horizon of the frontier, leaving behind a sky streaked with red and violet. The last rays of light fade slowly, swallowed by the vastness of wilderness. As darkness spreads, Asolance falls heavy and unbroken, except for the sound of the wind or deafened cry of an animal in the distance. A cabin stands alone, its small windows glowing faintly with firelight. Inside, a family gathers together, surrounded by walls of rough-hewn logs. Beyond those walls, for miles in every direction, there is no one. This was the reality of isolation on the frontier, a solitude deeper than most people today could imagine. A life lived at the edge of human connection, where silence was not just an atmosphere, but a way of being. To live in isolation was to accept distance as a constant companion. Neighbors, when they existed at all, could be 5 or 10 miles away, sometimes more. A journey to see them required hours of walking or riding, often through dense forests or across open plains where weather could shift suddenly. Visits were rare, often saved for the most important reasons: help in building a barn, gathering for harvest, or seeking aid in sickness. Days, weeks, and sometimes even months passed without seeing another household. Families learned to rely almost entirely on themselves, not because they wished to, but because there was no other choice. The isolation of the frontier was not only physical, but emotional. For settlers who had left behind towns, villages, and communities in the east, the silence of the wilderness could be overwhelming. In the places they once knew, the sound of neighbors working, children playing, church bells ringing, or markets bustling had been part of daily life. On the frontier, those sounds vanished. In their place came fellow moan of the wind, the rustle of trees, and the distant call of wild animals. Some found comfort in this quiet, but for many it was a heavy reminder of how far they had traveled from the world they once knew. Imagine standing outside your cabin on a moonless night. The darkness is total, stretching in every direction. The nearest town is perhaps 30 miles away, reachable only by horse or wagon, along paths that vanish in the shadows. There are no lanterns glowing in distant windows, no distant hum of activity. Festers burn bright, thousands of them scattered across the sky, and the silence is almost complete. It is beautiful, yes, but also humbling. You feel small beneath the endless heavens, and the weight of solitude presses against you. Communication with the outside world was painfully slow. Letters carried news from family left behind, but they traveled on horseback, by stagecoach, or by wagon, taking weeks or even months to arrive. When a letter finally reached a cabin, it was read again and again, every word treasured, every sentence carrying the voice of someone far away. The gap between letters was long, sometimes so long that by the time news arrived, events had already changed. A sickness might have come and gone. A birth or a death might be months old before the words reached the frontier. This delay deepened the sense of separation, as though settlers were living in a different time altogether, their lives disconnected from those they once knew. Isolation shaped the rhythm of daily life. Each member of the family became both companion and coworker. Parents and children depended on one another, not just for survival, but for social connection. Brothers and sisters grew close, not only through blood, but through necessity, for they were often each other's only playmates, only confidants, and only friends. Arguments happened, of course, as they do in any household, but there was no escape from one another. The walls of the cabin held them together through every season, every hardship, and every passing day. For many women, isolation carried its own unique weight. In towns, there might have been gatherings, sewing circles, or shared work among neighbors. On the frontier, the long hours of tending children, cooking, sewing, and caring for animals often fell in near silence. A woman might not see another adult woman. For weeks, her world confined to her family and the wilderness. Diaries kept by pioneer women often spoke of this loneliness, the longing for conversation, the ache for companionship beyond the daily circle of family. Some found solace in writing, keeping careful records of their days, pouring thoughts into paper as a way to speak when no one else was there to listen. Men, too, carried the burden of solitude. Long hunting trips meant days spent alone in the forest, walking quietly, listening only to the sound of their own footsteps. Even in the company of family, the absence of a wider community could voices to share worries with, fewer hands to share work, and fewer hearts to share joy. The weight of responsibility pressed harder when no one else was near to help carry it. Children felt isolation in ways both harsh and innocent. They learned early that friends were not easily found, that games were played with siblings or alone. A doll made of cloth scraps, a ball of rags, or a carved piece of wood became their companions. Their play often mirrored work, pretend farming, building miniature cabins, or hunting imaginary animals. When they did finally meet neighbor children, the joy was immense, the games lively and loud. The bond formed quickly because it was so rare. Yet those meetings ended as quickly as they came, and the quiet treated religion and faith often became a source of comfort in isolation. Families gathered on Sundays, even if there was no church nearby, to read from a Bible, sing hymns, and pray together. These moments of ritual gave structure the endless solitude, a reminder that though they were far from others, they were not entirely alone in spirit. When preachers traveled through holding services in cabins or barns, settlers flocked eagerly, not only for worship, but for the chance to see new faces, to share words, to remember what it felt like to be part of a community. The seasons deepened the feeling of isolation in different ways. Summer brought long days of labor, but also the possibility of travel to see neighbors or to gather supplies from distant towns. Winter, however, sealed families inside their cabins. For weeks at a time, snow blocked paths, froze rivers, and cut off movement. Storms raged, and the wind howled outside, making the cabin feel even smaller, more enclosed, more separate from the rest of the world. In those long nights, stories were told by firelight, and songs were sung softly to pass the hours. Yet the sense of being cut off lingered, and many families marked time by counting the days until the thaw came. Even joy carried with its mark of distance. A birth was a celebration, but without neighbors to share it, the news traveled slowly. A wedding might be witnessed only by family, with no grand gathering, no crowd of guests. Death, too, came with its own loneliness. Graves were dug by family hands, marked with stones or wooden crosses, often with no minister to speak words over them. The loss, washivi, and the silence, heavier still, as grief settled over households already accustomed to solitude. Yet in the midst of isolation, there was also a strange kind of strength. Families learned to draw deeply from within themselves, to find companionship in their own small circles, to endure silence without breaking. They spoke less, perhaps, but when they did speak, their words mattered. They shared not only tasks, but also hearts bound together tight libest. They had no one else. There were moments of unexpected beauty in solitude, sitting by the fire at night, listening to the steady breathing of loved ones nearby. A parent might feel an overwhelming sense of peace. Walking alone through the forest, the sound of bird song and the rustle of leaves might feel like a conversation with the earth itself. Looking up at a sky filled with stars, a settler might feel less alone, as though the universe itself was keeping them company. These moments did not erase the hardship, but they softened it, reminding those who endured that solitude could also carry wonder. The frontier taught people to balance the weight of isolation with the quiet gifts it carried. It was a life stripped of constant voices, stripped of crowds and noise, but filled instead with the closeness of family, the beauty of the natural world, and the strength of endurance. To survive isolation was to learn patience, to learn resilience, and to learn the value of every connection, no matter how rare or fleeting. And so, as night deepened across the frontier, the cabin lights flickered and dimmed. Inside, families drifted to sleep, holding each other close against the loneliness that pressed at the walls. Outside, the wilderness stretched on, vast and silent, a reminder of distance, but also of the resilience that kept life moving forward, even in solitude. The wilderness of the frontier was both a provider and a threat. It offered wood for cabins, streams for water, and game for food. But it also carried dangers that tested the courage of every family who chose to live there. Life was a balance between gratitude and fear, between what the land gave and what it could so suddenly take away. To survive in the edge of the wilderness meant living with the constant awareness that danger could emerge at any hour from the shadows of the forest, from the skies above, or from the earth itself. One oft greatest dangers came from wild animals, creatures that shared the land long before cabins rose from clearings. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries drifting through the night air and sending a shiver down the spine of those listening in the dark. Alone, a wolf was rarely bold enough to approach a cabin, but in packs they grew fearless. They prowled the edges of settlements, eyes glowing in the firelight, watching livestock with hunger. Chickens, goats, sheep, and even young calves could vanish in the night, carried off by predators, quick and silent. Families built strong pens, reinforced fences, and kept watch with rifles at hand, knowing that hunger drove wild creatures close. Bears were an even greater threat. They roamed the forests and hills in search of food. A bear could destroy a food store in a single night, ripping through barrels of grain, tearing into smoked meat, or smashing apart a beehive. Encounters were terrifying, for rifles of the day were slow to reload, and a bear's strength was unmatched. Settlers told stories of men who had fought them with axes, knives, or even their bare hands when no other choice remained. For families, the sound of heavy steps outside the cabin at night was enough to still every voice and make hearts pound until the danger passed. Cougars or mountain lions also haunted the wilderness, silent hunters who could stalk travelers unseen, their padded steps leaving no sound on the forest floor. They attacked livestock, but they were also known to threaten lone settlers, especially children or those traveling on foot. Tales spread of settlers glimpsing yellow eyes in the tree line, feeling watched, only to hurry home under the weight of fear. To survive such encounters required vigilance, courage, and an unshakable sense of awareness, for danger might come at the very moment one felt most at ease. Smaller dangers crept as well. Snakes coiled in tall grass or hidden beneath rocks struck without warning. Abid could mean days of fever, swelling, and sometimes death, for medicines, Weriscars, and doctors were often miles away. Rattlesnakes rattled as a warning, but not always soon enough. Children gathering berries or women walking to streams sometimes met them suddenly, their cries carrying back to cabins where others rushed to help. The fear of a bite lingered in every step taken through brush or along paths. The wilderness also brought dangers in theft of insects and disease. Mosquitoes thrived near rivers and swamps, carrying fevers that settlers did not always understand. Malaria and other illnesses whipped through cabins, leaving families weak and struggling. Flies, while lice and ticks made life uncomfortable, constant reminders of how closely humans lived with the natural world. A single illness could spread quickly. 4 cabins were small, airless, and families had no choice but to live close together. Beyond the living creatures of the land, the forces of nature itself were often the most dangerous of all. Storms swept across the plains and forests with sudden fury. Winds tore at roofs, lightning struck trees, and rain turned dirt floors into mud. Tornadoes, where they appeared, were a devastating, ripping apart cabins and barns, scattering livestock and leaving destruction. In moments, families huddled together, praying as the storm roared outside, waiting for the silence that came after the silence that told them what had been lost. Floods washed through valleys, drowning crops and leaving fields coated with mud and debris. Rivers that seemed gentle could swell overnight with rains upstream, and by morning, families awoke to water rushing through their clearings. Entire food stores were sometimes ruined, animals lost, fences carried away. For settlers who lived by their harvests, such losses were not just inconvenient, they threatened survival itself. Fire carried their own terror. A single spark from a cooking fire, a lantern knocked over, or a lightning strike in dry grass could ignite flames that spread incontrollably. With few tools and little water at hand, settlers fought fire with shovels, blankets, and desperation, often losing more than they could save. Forest fires roared across the land, smoke filling the sky, turning day to night. Families sometimes fled ahead of the flames, carrying what they could, praying their cabin would still be standing when they returned. Winter held its own dangers, quiet but relentless. Snow fell heavy, burying paths and sealing families inside their homes. Food supplies dwindled quickly, and hunting grew nearly impossible in deep drifts. Frostbite threatened anyone who stayed out too long, and the cold itself could kill if fires burned low. Families told stories of travelers found frozen in the snow, lost only a short distance from safety. Silence of winter nights was beautiful, but it carried thewit of danger, for warmth was life, and without it life slipped away. Hunger was one of the most constant dangers, pressing on families from season to season. Crops sometimes failed, struck down by drought, storms, or insects. A swarm of locusts could descend suddenly, darkening the sky and leaving fields stripped bare within hours. Food carefully stored might spoil barrels laking or meat go. In such times, families rationed what they had, eating smaller portions, going without, hoping to last until the next hunt or the next harvest. Hunger gnawed not only at the body, but at the spirit, reminding settlers daily how fragile survival could be. The lack of medical care deepened every danger. A cut that grew infected, a broken bone, or a fever could mean the difference between life and death. Doctors were rare, medicines rare still. Families relied on home remedies, herbs gathered from the woods, or knowledge passed down through generations. Sometimes these cures helped, sometimes they did not. Then certainty added to the weight of every risk. A fall, a bite, or an illness carried consequences far heavier than they would today. Travel itself was dangerous. Roads were little more than trails, rutted, muddy, and often blocked by fallen trees or swollen rivers. Wagons tipped, horses stumbled, and travelers found themselves stranded miles from help. The wilderness was vast, and to be caught in it without shelter or supplies was a danger thoughted even the strongest. Some never returned from journeys that seemed simple at the start. Despite all these dangers, families endured. They built fences, carried rifles, and kept watch. They learned the signs of weather, the tracks of animals, and the ways of the land. Children grew up with sharp eyes and careful steps, taught early to respect the dangers that surrounded them. Settlers did not ignorate risks, but they lived with them, shaping their lives around them, adapting to the wilderness rather than fighting to control it. In the midst of these threats, moments of calm were treasured all the more. A night when no wolves howled, when the sky was clear and the stars shone bright, brought comfort. A season without storms, when crops grew tall and green, felt like a gift. A winter when the firewood lasted, when no one fell sick, was remembered for years after. These small victories were what settlers carried in their hearts, proof that even in a world filled with dangers, life could still bring peace and joy. And so the frontier was never silent, never truly safe. Every sound in the night, every shadow on the edge of the clearing, every change in the wind carried with it the possibility of danger. Yet families stayed not because the land was easy, but because they believed in the life it could one day give. They endured hunger, storms, sickness, and fear, holding fast to hope, to courage, and to one another. In face of danger, they found resilience. In the midst of fear, they found strength. And as the night deepened across the wilderness, as cabins glowed softly with firelight and families gathered close, they slept with refills by the door, food hidden carefully away, and prayers on their lips. Outside, the wild world moved on, filled with creatures and storms, shadows and silence. Inside, hearts beat steady, carrying the determination that no danger, however great, would take away their will to endure. The frontier was a land of constant hardship, but beneath every challenge there was something deeper, something that carried families forward when storms raged, when hunger gnawed, and when isolation pressed against their hearts. That something was resilient, quiet, steady strength that did not come from abundance or us, but from the simple decision to endure. To live on the frontier was to accept that every day might bring trial, yet to rise each morning with the will to go on, to plant again, to hunt again, to hope again. The spirit of resilience was the true lifeblood of those who built their homes in the wilderness. Resilience was not born in a stickmin. It grew in small steps, in daily choices, in patience stretched across endless seasons. A mother waking before dawn to knead bread, though flour waskars, showed resilience. A father repairing a fence battered by storms, though his hands ached and his body was weary, showed resilience. Children gathering wood, hauling water, or tending to animals long after they were tired, showed resilience. These acts were not grand, but they carried the weight of survival. Each choice to keep moving, to keep working, was a thread in the fabric of resilience. The heart of this strength was hope, a belief that tomorrow might be kinder than today. When crops failed, settlers planted again. When illness struck, they nursed sick with every bit of knowledge they had. When storms tore down cabins, they rebuilt log by log, board by board. Even in the harshest winters, when hunger sat heavily at the table, and the cold crept through every crack, families looked toward spring, toward first green shoots that promised life's return. Hope was not blind, nor was it easy. It was stubborn, almost defiant, a light that flickered in the darkest times, but refused to go out. Resilience also grew from faith not only in God, though for many that faith was strong, but also in one another. Families leaned on each other, drawing strength from shared burdens. A father's strength, a mother's steady presence, a child's laughter in the midst of hardship, these were anchors. When neighbors were near, even if miles apart, they offered help in times of need, and in return received it when their own troubles came. This network of trust and kindness wove resilience into the fabric of community, reminding settlers that even in isolation, they were not entirely alone. Resilience was felt in the rhythm of the seasons. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending, autumn meant harvesting, and winter meant enduring. Each cycle repeated year after year, and though each brought its trials, each also carried renewal. The act of planting seeds after a hard winter was an act of faith, a declaration that life would continue. The harvest, however small, was proof that perseverance bore fruit. Even the simple act of lighting a fire on a cold night carried within it the essence of resilience, for it meant choosing warmth over despair, choosing life over surrender. The spirit of resilience was also visible in the small joys. Settlers allowed themselves a simple meal shared by firelight, a song sung softly while working, a moment of laughter despite hardships. These were not luxuries but necessities. They were reminders that life was not only struggle but also beauty. Children played games with sticks and stones, inventing worlds in the wilderness. Families told stories that stretched across generations, binding the past to the present. These acts of joy were resilience, for they proved that hardship could not steal the spirit of those who chose to live fully, even in difficulty. At times, resilience meant facing grief. Death was a common visitor to the frontier, whether from sickness, accident, or hunger. Families mourned, but even in mourning they found ways to carry on. A cabin could not remain heated, fields could not remain untended, and children could not go unfed. The living honored the memory oft lost by continuing, by surviving, by enduring the hardships that had claimed others. Resilience was the quiet strength to keep walking step by step even when hearts were heavy. The frontier was a place where resilience shaped not only survival but identity. To be a pioneer was to be strong, not always in body, but always in spirit. It meant accepting that life would not be easy, but believing it was worthwhile. It meant rising after being knocked down again and again until success came, or until failure was simply not an option. The land itself demanded resilience, for it yielded only to those who worked it tirelessly, season after season. Resilience was not only about enduring, but about adapting. When familiar methods failed, settlers found new ways. When tools broke, they mended them. When the land seemed barren, they experimented with crops or hunting grounds. Ingenuity was resilience, in action a refusal to accept defeat. Children grew up watching their parents solve problems with whatever was at hand, learning early that resilience was not about never falling, but about always finding a way to rise again. The nights were long on the frontier, and in those hours of quiet resilience often meant holding fast against fear. Wolf-shouldered storms rattled cabins. The unknown pressed in from every shadow, yet families lay together, whispering prayers, sharing warmth, and waiting for dawn. Each sunrise was a victory, proof that they had endured the night. In this way, resilience was not only about great acts of survival, but about the steady courage of waiting, of trusting that light would always return after darkness. Resilience also lived in memory. Families remembered the struggles of those who came before them, drawing strength from their endurance. Stories of grandparents who crossed rivers, of parents who survived famines, of neighbors who rebuilt after fire. All these tales reminded settlers that they were not the first to face hardship and would not be the last. Memory became a source of courage, a well from which resilience was drawn. Children raised on the frontier carried resilience in their hearts for life. They learned early that comfort was fleeting, that safety was never certain, but that strength came from within. A child who had spent nights hungry, days working, and years watching parents endure grew into an adult who knew the meaning of resilience. Seedly, these children would carry that strength into their own families, passing it down through generations, ensuring that resilience remained the unspoken inheritance of the frontier. Resilience was also a form of quiet defiance. It was the settler's way of saying to the wilderness, to storms, to hunger, and to fear, "You may press us, but you will not break us." Every repaired roof, every planted seed, every child born and raised was an answer to hardship, a declaration that life would go on. The frontier was harsh, but the spirit of those who lived there was unyielding. In the end, resilience was what made the frontier possible. Without it, cabins would have crumbled, fields would have lain